We will now begin the lecture of Chapter 5, which deals with cost-volume-profit relationships. Cost-volume-profit relationships, and CVP analysis as it's commonly referred to, is one of the most powerful tools that managers have available to them. What CVP, cost-volume-profit, helps managers understand is the relationship between the prices of a product, the volume of an activity, the per unit variable cost, the total fixed cost, and the mix of products sold. CVP is a tool which helps managers determine which products to manufacture or sell, what pricing policy to follow, and what marketing strategy to employ, and at what type of productive facilities to acquire. With CVP analysis, the first thing we're going to discuss is how a change in activity can affect contribution margin and net operating income. Before we go too far, the basics of cost-volume-profit analysis is the contribution margin income statement, or the concept of contribution margin. As we discussed last week, contribution margin is extremely helpful to a manager in judging the impact on profits due to a change in the selling price, the cost, or the volume. By using a traditional income statement, it's very difficult to see some of this effect. So a contribution margin income statement is one in which we separate the expenses into their variable expenses and fixed expenses. And with the contribution margin income statement, we take the sales revenue minus all variable cost to give us contribution margin. That contribution margin is the amount remaining from sales revenue after variable cost that enables a company to cover its fixed cost and provide a profit. So with this CVP analysis, the emphasis is on cost behavior, is what we're going to look at. Whether the cost is variable, in other words, in total, the cost changes based on some level of activity, or as a fixed cost, where the cost does not change based on any level of activity. Okay, in looking at contribution margin, all right, one of the things we should look at, all right, is that contribution margin is first used to cover fixed cost. Any remaining contribution margin contributes towards operating income. So for the Racing Bicycle Company, for the month of June, when they sell 500 bikes, they have revenue of $250,000. They have variable cost of $150,000. Their contribution margin is the difference. Given the fact that they have fixed cost of $80,000, their contribution margin exceeds fixed cost, and therefore they have a profit of $20,000. As you can see, all right, contribution margin is needed to cover fixed cost. We can express contribution margin both as on a per unit basis as well as in total. So let's look at per unit basis. All right, when we look at this, for the Racing Bicycle Company, they sold 500 bikes. Each bike is sold at a price of $500. Each bike, assuming that Racing Bicycle Company is a retail store, they purchase each bike for $300, sell it for $500. So their contribution margin per unit is $200 per bike. So in total, when you sell 500 bikes, your revenue is 500 times 500, $250,000. Your variable cost is 500 bikes times 300 bikes, 300 variable cost per unit, $150,000. Contribution margin is $100,000, simply the difference between sales and variable cost, or 500 bikes multiplied by $200, $100,000. So for every additional bike after 500 bikes that Racing Bicycle sells, they will increase their net operating income by $200. They'll also increase their contribution margin by $200. You'll notice that each month, Racing Bicycle Company must generate at least $80,000 in contribution margin to break even. All right, break even is the level of sales at which profit equals zero. So if Racing Bicycle Company's contribution margin was $80,000, given the fact their fixed cost is $80,000, their net operating income would be zero. Therefore, the break-even point is the point at which contribution margin equals fixed cost. Once a company has reached their break-even point, net income will increase by the unit contribution for each additional unit sold. So once we reach the break-even point, every additional unit sold, profit increases by the amount of contribution margin per unit. If we take a look at this if we take a look at this contribution income statement, we will see that when our racing bicycle company sells 400 units in a month, or 400 bikes, they'll operate at the break-even point. Because 400 bikes at $500 of a sales price per bike yields $200,000 in revenue. The variable cost would be $120,000, 400 at $300 per bike. Therefore, the difference would be our contribution margin. $200,000 less $120,000 yields contribution margin of $80,000. Fixed cost of $80,000 yields a net operating income of $0. Once you understand the concept of contribution margin, if I was to have told you that you were going to sell 500 bikes, you could quickly determine that contribution margin would be $80,000, 400 times 200. Therefore, the understanding of the contribution margin relationship is important. Knowing that your fixed costs are 80, you would know that you were at the break-even point, because you'd know the contribution margin is 80,000, fixed cost is 80,000. Therefore, your profit would be 0, and that would be the break-even point. Notice that when you increase your sales per month to 401 bikes, just as we mentioned a few slides ago, your profit goes up by the amount of contribution margin, which is $200. One more bike sold will yield $500 more revenue, $300 more variable cost, $200 more contribution margin. Keeping in mind, fixed costs do not change based on changes in activity. Therefore, our net operating income would be $200. This concludes our short abbreviated lecture on the contribution margin income statement. I want you to now work on exercise 5-1, part 1, on page 213. So page 213, exercise 5-1, part 1. Please stop the video at this point and then come back to it, and I will display the solution to exercise 5-1, part 1. Now let's discuss the solution to exercise 5-1. Alright, part 1. In this problem, Wheeler Corporation gives you their most recent income statement. Alright, and it's set up in the contribution format, where sales revenue for 8,000 units is $208,000, variable cost of $144,000, contribution margin $64,000, fixed cost of $56,000, yielding a net operating income of $8,000. In this problem, each unit is sold for $26, has a variable cost of $18, and therefore has a contribution margin of $8 per unit. We're asked in part 1 to determine and prepare a new contribution format income statement where the sales volume has increased by 50 units. So in other words, sales volume will be 8,050 units. In that particular situation, we can draw up this contribution margin income statement in one of two ways. We can, as you can see, we can multiply it all the way through. 8,050 units multiplied by $26 gives us $209,300. Variable cost will be 8,050 units multiplied by $18, $144,900. Let me stop and just preface by saying I note that over the years, students, when they work on this material, one of the common problems they have is keeping in mind that whatever units you have in your sales revenue must also be in your variable cost. So for instance, you couldn't sell the unit unless you had paid for it first, built it, bought it, whatever it might be. So sales revenue less variable cost gives us contribution margin of $64,400, less our fixed cost of $56,000, gives us net operating income of $8,400. Now, you may have seen this already, but you can quickly take a shortcut. You could say that originally my net operating income was $8,000 as given in the book. If I'm going to sell 50 more units and have $8 of contribution margin for every additional unit, I'm going to increase my profit by $400. Therefore, my profit will be $8,000 plus $400, or $8,400. This concludes our discussion of the solution for exercise 5-1. As we saw with exercise 5-1, All right, we don't need to prepare an entire income statement to estimate the profit at a particular sales volume. All we need to do is multiply the number of units sold above the break-even point by the contribution margin per unit. So if Racing Bicycle Company was to sell 430 bikes, its net operating income would be $6,000. 30 bikes multiplied by $200 of contribution margin per bike. Okay, this contribution format income statement can be expressed in other ways. I know some students like to work with equations. All right, therefore I'll demonstrate here that cost volume profit is built on this equation. Profit equals sales minus variable cost minus fixed cost. The equation can be used to show the profit of RBC, Racing Bicycle Company, if they sell 401 bikes. Notice the answer of $200 is the same as we found when we drew up the contribution margin income statement. If we were to multiply 401 units times $500, 401 units times $300, subtract the $80,000 of fixed cost, we would end up with our $200,500 of revenue minus our variable cost of $120,300 less our fixed cost. We would have $200 of profit. Alright, when a company only has one product, we'll see later on when a company has more than one product, basically we can determine the profit by taking the price times the quantity minus the variable cost times the quantity minus fixed cost. Alright, people like algebra like to work with equations. It can be done this way also. So for instance, going back to our Racing Bicycle Company, price of $500 times 401, which is the number of units sold, minus 300 times 401, less the $80,000, gives us $200 of profit. Okay, we can continue to work with this, alright, where we could refine it even further by just taking the unit of contribution margin times the quantity minus the fixed cost. You probably saw that shortcut on one of these slides. Okay, looking just like this. The contribution margin is $200 multiplied by 401 units less the 80 grand gives us profit of $200.